Hello, everyone. I wanted to look at the makeup quiz for our missed class on Friday, review the questions, give you a sense of what I had in mind. Question one: what is the serious problem for relativism that the author points out? This is here under objections to relativism. Relativism. Relative to whom or relative to what? In the second paragraph, he says, this is a serious problem for relativism. And the serious problem is the idea of a culture, as he goes on to say, because the concept of a culture is so vague and ill defined that it becomes almost useless for ethical discussions. And then he gives an example of abolitionists in the United States prior to the Civil War. And I think it's a good point. That is to say that in America, according to its cultural morality before the Civil War, slavery was morally acceptable. That is not true. That is, the situation was much more complex than that. There was disagreement. And so the notion that there's like a well defined cultural moral code for any place at any time is just way too simple because there's always diversity and disagreement. So this is a serious problem for cultural relativism because you have to define what a culture is. And if you say that it's too easy to say something like, well, according to the code, the moral code of this culture, well, what is the moral code of this culture? How do you define something like that? Who gets to say? So it is I think he's right. It is a serious problem for relativism, but that doesn't mean it's an unanswerable one. You just need a more complex theory, but it's a good point, I think. Question two: the author contends that relativism leads to absurd consequences that allows for things which are obviously wrong behaviors. Is this a good point? Why or why not? Well, I mean, is it a good point? Like this is in this section here. Things just seem wrong. I mean, it is a good point. You know, it is a good point. Uh, on the other hand, it's a terrible point. It's a good point in the sense that it appeals to our sense of decency. Like say that we came across a culture in which cruelty to children was considered virtuous behavior. We would never accept it because it would just be so shocking to our sense of fundamental decency and conscience that we would never accept it. On the other hand, a move like that is called begging the question, right? That is, begging the question is when you assume what you ought to be proving and you beg the question if you say, well, I mean, relativism must be wrong because it leads to absurd consequences. Well, I mean, why is it absurd? Because it offends our sense of decency? The whole idea is that our sense of decency is relative, right? So, in one sense, it's a very good point that he makes because it's convincing. On the other hand, philosophically, it's very weak because it begs the question. Question three: what things does the author say are not worthy of tolerance? Is he right? Well, I mean, okay. What does he say? Child abuse, slavery, senseless violence. Um, is he right? Well, yes, of course he's right. You know, on the other hand, same thing applies. It's kind of begging the question, right? Because he hasn't proved that those things are morally not worthy of tolerance. All he's basically said is that they're not worthy of tolerance. He's just assumed that they're not. And again, we agree with him because we share his cultural bias. I agree with him 100%. I would never tolerate those things. But what does that mean? Does that mean that those things are inherently intolerable, or does it mean that a person like me and you, according to the way that we think morally relative to our culture, would never tolerate those things? So, it's an interesting. There's always two answers to these things. These questions. Is he right? Well, in one sense, he's absolutely right. I would never tolerate those things morally. In another sense, philosophically, is he right? Probably not, because he begs the question.